Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive.
Mm.
Today we're going to be talking about something that's actually pretty important to the American justice system,
It is.
plea bargains.
Yes.
So, um, I don't know about you, but like when I think about criminal justice, I think about, you know,
Law and order,
yeah, law and order, the big dramatic courtroom,
the trial.
the trial,
Yeah.
but like that's not actually.
Really, what happens?
Yeah.
Oh.
So we read this article from Investor called Plea Bargains Uncover the Cracks in America's Justice System.
Right.
And it was really fascinating because it kind of pointed out that plea bargains are like way more important to how the system actually works.
Yes, they are the system.
Yeah.
The vast majority of cases are resolved this way.
Yeah. They said something like 95% of felony convictions
Wow.
come from plea bargains, not trials.
Yeah, it's really a staggering number when you think about it.
It is. So I guess maybe like the first thing is like, what is a plea bargain?
So a plea bargain is basically an agreement between the defendant and the prosecution where the defendant agrees to plead guilty, usually to a lesser charge,
Oh, so they might,
in exchange for...
with like a murder charge, but then they're like, okay, we'll plead guilty to like manslaughter or something.
Exactly, or something even lesser,
Why?
depending on the circumstances.
Okay.
And so they do that in exchange for a lighter sentence than they would have gotten if they had gone to trial and been convicted.
Well, okay. So it's kind of like it's a way to,
Compromise.
yeah, it's a compromise. It's a way to kind of like streamline things, make sure that cases move through the system.
So is that like the main reason that they exist, is just to like keep things moving?
Well, the article talks about how historically plea bargains emerged as a way to deal with an overburdened court system.
Oh, that makes sense.
As the population grew and the number of criminal cases increased, plea bargains became a way to prevent the whole system from just getting completely bogged down. Right. Yeah. Because, I mean, like, imagine, like, if every single case had to go to a full-blown trial. I mean,
It'd be impossible.
yeah, the system would just grind to a halt.
Exactly. It would just be completely unmanageable.
So I guess, like, on the one hand, like, I get it, right? Like, you need to have some way to keep things moving. But,
Sure.
but on the other hand, like, it just makes me kind of wonder, like, are we sacrificing justice for efficiency here?
Well, and that is exactly the tension that the article is exploring.
Okay.
This idea of efficiency versus justice.
Right. Because, like,
Because in theory, the goal of the justice system should be to ensure that the right outcome is reached in every case,
yeah.
that justice is served. But when you're prioritizing speed and efficiency, it raises the question of whether that's always happening.
Right, because like it seems like if someone's innocent but they feel pressured to take a plea bargain just to like avoid the risk of like a really harsh sentence.
Exactly. And the article actually talks about this.
Really?
They highlight the story of Charles Gampero Sr., whose son was facing some very serious charges. And the judge basically said to him, look, you can either take this plea deal or your son is risking, potentially spending decades in prison.
Oh, wow. So it's like take the deal or...
Take the deal or roll the dice and hope for the best.
Yeah. And I mean, like if it was my kid, I mean, I don't know what I would do in that situation.
It's an impossible choice.
Yeah. And like, how do you even know, like, is your lawyer good? Are they going to be able to like actually defend you properly? I mean...
Right. And that's a whole other layer of complexity that we can get into.
Yeah, because like what if your lawyer is like overworked or just not that good?
Well, that's another major issue that the article brings up, this question of inadequate legal counsel, because, not everyone can afford a high-priced attorney, and so a lot of people end up relying on public defenders.
And are public defenders like
But the problem is...
not very good?
Well, the problem is that public defenders are often completely overwhelmed with cases.
Oh, so they just have like way too many.
They have way too many clients, they don't have enough time, they don't have enough resources, and that means that they can't give each case the attention that it really deserves.
So then they're not really able to like properly investigate or like, build a good defense for their client.
Exactly. And the article actually has this really striking quote from an attorney named Stephen Bright, who says that he often sees public defenders in court who don't even recognize their own clients.
Oh, wow.
Like they don't even know who they're representing.
That's crazy.
Yeah, it's a really disturbing thought.
It is. So basically it's like you're already in this system that's like kind of pushing you towards taking a plea deal. And then you might not even have a lawyer who's like actually able to like fight for you properly.
It can feel like the deck is stacked against you.
Yeah. And then like, what about like people who are actually innocent? I mean, like, is there a risk that innocent people are pleading guilty just because they're like scared of what might happen if they go to trial?
That's a really troubling possibility, and unfortunately, it's not just theoretical.
Yeah.
The article highlights the case of Irma Faye Stewart, who was a single mother arrested on drug charges. And she always maintained her innocence, but she was facing a really long potential sentence, and she felt like she had no choice but to plead guilty so that she could get back to her children.
So she just felt like she couldn't risk it.
Yeah, she couldn't risk the possibility of being separated from her kids for years and years.
And like, how do you even make that decision? I mean, that's like an impossible situation to be in.
It really is. And her story just highlights the human cost of this system. It's not just about abstract legal principles. It's about real people's lives being profoundly affected by these decisions.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder, like, is justice really blind when like all these other factors are coming into play?
Well, that's a really important question, and one that we'll continue to explore as we delve deeper into this article and the complexities of the plea bargain system.
Okay, so I guess we're just getting started here.
Yeah, we're just scratching the surface.
But it's already clear that there's a lot more to this issue than meets the eye. So stick with us as we continue our deep dive into the world of plea bargains.
We'll be right back after a quick break. Yeah, it's like when you're facing that kind of situation, it's not just about, are you guilty or not? It's like, what are the potential consequences for your family?
Yeah, like you're not just thinking about yourself, you're thinking about like your kids, your loved ones, and how this is going to impact them.
Exactly. And it raises the question of, are plea bargains obtained under that kind of duress? Are they truly voluntary?
Right, like are you really making a free choice, or are you just being forced into it because you're terrified of what might happen if you don't?
And, that leads to the really troubling possibility of innocent people pleading guilty just to avoid the risk of like a much harsher sentence.
Yeah, it's a scary thought. And like the article talks about how the quality of legal representation can play a huge role in all of this.
It does.
So like what happens if you can't afford a good lawyer?
Well, that's another major issue that the article explores, this idea of inadequate legal counsel.
Right, because like not everyone can afford to hire, some fancy lawyer.
Exactly. And so a lot of people end up relying on public defenders who are, overworked and underpaid.
And so are public defenders like generally not very good?
Well, it's not necessarily that they're not good. It's that they're just completely swamped with cases.
Oh, so they just have like way too many clients to actually be able to like give each one enough attention?
Right. They have massive caseloads. They don't have enough time. They don't have enough resources. And that means they can't really do the kind of thorough investigation or build the kind of defense that their clients really deserve.
Yeah, because like I imagine like to really build a good defense, you got to like really dig into the details,
Yeah.
like investigate the evidence, talk to witnesses, all that stuff.
Absolutely. You need time to really understand the case and explore all the possible options. And when you're juggling hundreds of cases at once, it's just not realistic to expect that level of attention for each one.
Right. And so like the article had this quote that was pretty crazy. It was from an attorney named Stephen Bright. And he said that he often sees public defenders in court who don't even recognize their own clients.
Yeah, that's a pretty shocking image, isn't it?
It is. Yeah. Like that you're in court and your lawyer is like, who are you?
It really highlights how broken the system is, when you have lawyers who are so overloaded that they can't even remember the faces of the people they're supposed to be representing.
So it's like you're already in this system that's kind of like pushing you towards taking a plea deal. And then on top of that, you might not even have a lawyer who can like actually fight for you.
Yeah, it can feel like a very hopeless situation.
And then like, what about racial disparities? Like, does race play a role in all of this?
Oh, absolutely. The article talks about how the plea bargain system can actually exacerbate existing racial inequalities in the criminal justice system.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, for one thing, studies have shown that people of color are more likely to be offered plea deals that are less favorable than those offered to white defendants.
So like, even if they're charged with the same crime, they might get offered a worse deal.
Exactly. And then there's also the issue of implicit bias, both on the part of prosecutors and judges, which can influence the way that cases are handled and the kinds of sentences that are handed down.
So it's like, even if people are trying to be fair, like,
Yeah.
there might be unconscious biases that are affecting their decisions.
Exactly. And then you also have to consider the historical context, the fact that the criminal justice system has a long and troubled history of discriminating against people of color.
Yeah, I mean, like, that's definitely a factor.
So when you have a system that's already built on a foundation of inequality, it's not surprising that those inequalities would show up in the plea bargaining process as well.
And the article talked about this case in Hearn, Texas, where there was this drug sweep and almost everyone who was arrested was black.
Yeah, that case is a really stark example of how racial bias can play out in practice.
So it's like they were specifically targeting black people.
Well, their article doesn't say that explicitly, but it definitely raises questions about whether certain communities are being unfairly targeted by law enforcement.
Right, because like if you just look at the numbers, it's hard to ignore that pattern.
And, even if there isn't like outright intentional discrimination, there might be policies or practices that have a disparate impact on certain racial groups.
And like, what about the long-term consequences of a plea bargain? Like, let's say someone takes a plea deal, they serve their time, they get out. Like, is that the end of it?
Unfortunately, it's often not that simple. A criminal record, even one stemming from a plea bargain, can have really long-lasting effects.
Oh, really? Like, how so?
Well, for one thing, it can make it incredibly difficult to find a job.
Oh, yeah. I could see that, like, a lot of employers probably don't want to hire someone with a criminal record.
Exactly. And then it can also affect your ability to get housing. Landlords might be reluctant to rent to you if you have a criminal history.
And, like, what about, like, loans and stuff?
Yeah, it can affect your access to credit, your ability to get loans. Even things like, getting a professional license or going back to school
Yeah.
can be really challenging with a criminal record.
It's like even after you served your time, you're still kind of being punished.
Right. It's like this mark that follows you around and can make it really hard to move on with your life.
And the article talked about how, in some states, a felony conviction can even result in the loss of your voting rights.
Yeah, that's a really disturbing consequence, because it means that even after you've paid your debt to society, you're still being denied a fundamental right of citizenship.
And, like, how do you even justify that? I mean, like, if someone served their time, they should be able to vote.
Well, there are arguments on both sides. Some people argue that felons have forfeited their right to participate in the democratic process,
I mean, I guess I can see that perspective.
while others argue that it's a form of disenfranchisement that disproportionately affects communities of color and perpetuates cycles of inequality.
Yeah, I mean, like, it definitely seems like it would have that effect.
And, it also raises the question of what is the purpose of punishment? Is it about retribution or is it about rehabilitation?
Right? Like, are we trying to punish people or are we trying to help them reintegrate into society?
And how do plea bargains with their potential for both expediency and compromise,
Yeah.
how do they fit into that larger framework?
Yeah, it's like a lot to think about.
It really is. And I think, the article doesn't provide easy answers, but it definitely raises a lot of important questions that we as a society need to be grappling with.
And I think one of the things that's becoming clear to me is that like the plea bargain system, it's not just about like the legal aspects of it, it's also about the human impact.
Absolutely. It's about real people's lives and the decisions they make under often incredibly difficult circumstances.
And like we were talking about before with Irma Faye Stewart, like sometimes people plead guilty even when they believe they're innocent just because they feel like they have no other choice.
Right. And that's a really troubling thought, because it suggests that the system might be convicting innocent people just because they're too afraid or too desperate to fight back.
Yeah. And like, how do we even know how often that's happening? I mean, like if most cases are resolved through plea bargains and we don't actually have trials to determine guilt or innocence.
Well, that's one of the challenges. Because plea bargains often happen behind closed doors, it's hard to know exactly what factors are influencing those decisions and whether justice is truly being served.
So it's kind of like a black box in a way.
In a way, yeah. And I think that's one of the reasons why this article is so important. It's shining a light on a part of the justice system that often gets overlooked.
And I think it's making us realize that like plea bargains, they're not just some like technical legal thing. They have real consequences for people's lives.
They do. And I think it's important to remember that every time we hear about a case ending in a guilty plea, there's a whole story behind that plea.
Right? Like there are reasons why that person chose to plead guilty, and those reasons might not always be straightforward.
And it's important to be curious about those stories, to ask questions about what factors might have influenced that plea. Was it truly a voluntary and informed decision? And what are the long-term consequences for that individual?
Yeah, because like justice, it's not just about like getting a conviction. It's about making sure that the process is fair
Yeah.
and that people's rights are being protected.
Exactly. And I think the plea bargain system, as it currently exists, raises a lot of questions about whether those goals are actually being met.
And it definitely seems like there's a lot of room for improvement.
There is. And I think that's what makes this conversation so important. By shedding light on these issues, we can start to think about ways to make the system more just and equitable.
And hopefully prevent innocent people from being punished for crimes they didn't commit.
Exactly. That's the
Yeah.
ultimate goal.
Right.
A justice system that actually serves justice.
Well said. And I think that's a good place to wrap up our deep dive for today.
Yeah, I think we've covered a lot of ground.
We have. But As always, this is just the beginning of the conversation.
Right. We encourage you to continue exploring these issues on your own, to read more about the plea bargain system, and to think critically about how it works and how it could be improved.
Because ultimately, this is about more than just like legal technicalities. It's about people's lives and their freedom.
Exactly. And it's up to all of us to ensure that the system is fair and just for everyone.
Well said, so.
Yeah.
Until next time, keep those minds curious and keep questioning the world around you.
Yeah.
It's wild, right? Like 95% of felony convictions from plea bargains, not trials. Like,
Yeah.
is that really giving us an accurate picture of crime?
It makes you wonder, right? Like, what are we actually measuring here? Are we measuring actual guilt, or are we measuring, fear and desperation and like
Yeah.
the ability to navigate a really complex system?
And I guess that kind of goes back to that tension we were talking about before, like
Right.
efficiency versus justice.
Exactly. Like the system is clearly efficient.
Yeah.
It's processing a ton of cases. But at what cost? Are we sacrificing accuracy? Are we sacrificing fairness in the name of expediency?
And so, like, what do we do about it? I mean, are there any, like, alternatives to this system or, like,
Yeah.
ways to reform it?
There are people working on it. There are some legal scholars who advocate for like a much more robust public defender system.
Okay.
Making sure that everyone has access to quality legal representation, regardless of how much money they have.
Yeah, because, like, right now, it seems like if you can't afford a good lawyer, you're kind of screwed.
Yeah, the playing field is definitely not level.
So, like, more funding for public defenders.
Exactly. Give them more resources, lower their caseload so they can actually spend time with each client.
And, like, actually get to know them.
Right, and like actually investigate the case and build a proper defense.
Yeah, because, like, right now, it's like they're just so overwhelmed they can't really do their jobs effectively.
Right. And then there are also people who are talking about like stricter regulations on plea bargains, like maybe limiting the power of prosecutors to offer these like super coercive deals.
So, there should be some kind of, like, guidelines or something.
Yeah, like maybe there should be some limits on like how much lower a sentence can be if you take a plea deal, or
Okay.
maybe there should be some kind of review process to make sure that the plea is actually voluntary and that the defendant understands what they're giving up.
Because right now, it
Yeah.
seems like it's just kind of like whatever the prosecutor decides.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of power in the hands of the prosecution and not enough safeguards for the defendant.
So, like, what are some of the other ideas out there?
Well, there's also this growing movement exploring restorative justice models, which are really interesting.
Okay, I've heard of that. Like, what is it exactly?
So restorative justice is basically about like shifting the focus away from punishment and towards like repairing harm. So it's more about like bringing the victim and the offender together and having them talk about what happened and, trying to come up with a way to make things right.
So it's not just about, like, throwing someone in jail. It's about, like, actually trying to address the harm that was done.
Exactly. And it can involve things like, community service or restitution or even like an apology.
So it's more about, like, accountability and healing rather than just, like, punishment.
Right. And a lot of people believe that restorative justice can be a really powerful way to address crime, especially for like nonviolent offenses.
So, like, would that completely replace the plea bargain system?
Well, it's not necessarily about like replacing the system entirely, but it's about like having more options.
Okay.
So instead of just having like the choice between going to trial or taking a plea deal, maybe there could be other possibilities.
It's like more of a spectrum of options.
Exactly. And I think that's what we really need, a more holistic approach to justice that takes into account the needs of everyone involved.
Mm-hmm. And I think what's becoming clear to me is that, like, there's no easy answer here. It's a really complex issue, and it's going to require a lot of different solutions.
And it's going to require a lot of people working together, lawyers, judges, activists, policymakers. Everyone has a role to play in making the system better.
Yeah, because, like, this isn't just some, like, abstract legal debate. This is about real people's lives.
Exactly. And I think that's what we need to keep in mind. Behind every statistic, behind every case file, there's a human story.
And sometimes a really tragic one.
Yeah. And I think it's important to remember that and to approach these issues with empathy and compassion.
Yeah, well said. So I think that's a good note to end on.
I think so.
So to our listeners out there, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of plea bargains.
We hope this has given you some food for thought.
And that you'll continue to explore these issues and to advocate for a more just and equitable system for everyone.
Because justice should never be a matter of expediency. It should always be about truth and fairness.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So until next time, keep those minds curious and keep questioning the world around you.